I'm Katie Price, Curator of Collections here at the Williams College Museum of Art, and I'm very pleased to have all of you here today. Welcome to the museum, welcome to Williamstown if this is your first time. I'm really very excited to have Tom Crow and Ondine Chavoya here with us to talk about Warhol and Pop. This is the first of our three conversations this summer around Warhol. We started this series of programs in the spring, and they were really just wonderful sort of informal conversations between two people, two scholars, two artists, two people who would have perhaps known Warhol. Tom Crow teaches at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, where he's Rosalie Solow Professor. Tom has a very long list of varied publications and accomplishments, and I won't be able to read them all, but they include fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Clark, and a recent Guggenheim Fellowship. Tom is someone whose scholarship I've really admired for a long time. I think he's truly a role model for those of us who aspire to go beyond specializing in one sort of period or era of art history. Tom, as the former director of the Getty Research Institute, he has written and lectured on such wide-ranging topics as 18th century French painting, modern and contemporary art. Tom's groundbreaking Painters and Public Life in 18th Century Paris won the distinguished Charles Rufus Maury Prize from the College Art Association. And this past spring, he gave the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art that concentrated on exploring the changes in Europe after the fall of Napoleon. And Tom has recently published a book that I recommend you all run down to the museum shop and purchase. It's called The Long March of Pop, Art, Music, and Design, 1930 to 1995, where Tom takes up the very complicated matrices of pop, fills it with very eye-opening anecdotes and situates it in a well-researched social context. So if you're interested in any of those topics, art, music, or design, I think particularly for those of us who are fans of the 60s, I really recommend you read it. It's a great read. So Ondine Chavoya is Professor of Art and Latina Studies here at Williams, along with being the newly named Schumann Faculty Fellow in Democratic Studies. Ondine has held fellowships at the Getty and Smithsonian and authored numerous texts on Chicano art, avant-garde practice, performance, experimental cinema, and social space in Southern California. Ondine has boundless energy and for these and many other topics, and I have been a witness firsthand to his meticulous research and his commitment to artists and the preservation of their archives. Recent curatorial projects include the landmark exhibition on the performance and conceptual art group OSCO that resulted in OSCO Elite of the Obscure, a retrospective 1972 to 1987 with Rita Gonzalez. And Ondine also wrote and edited the award-winning catalog that accompanied that show in 2011. And I just want to say that project is still has had major ramifications in the art world and beyond. The new installation of the permanent collection at the Whitney Museum in New York owes a great debt to Ondine and his work on that group, because that group's work is displayed very prominently there. Ondine is currently working on the Chicano art critical anthology, as well as a seminal exhibition and book project called Chicano Chic, Queer Networks of LA 1968 to 1985 that will be on view at LA MoCA in a few years in 2017. So again, please join me in welcoming Tom and Ondine.
Thank you, Katie, for that lovely, lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out. It's really, really tremendous, and I'm incredibly honored to be here to help facilitate this conversation with Tom Crow. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to come back and see this extraordinary exhibition. So congratulations to you, Katie, and Matt for this really remarkable landmark exhibition. Kudos. It's beautiful. Tom, as Katie was reading your biography, I was struck yet again by the idea that you began your academic career writing about 18th century French art and then went on to produce some very influential books on 18th and 19th century art. So when and how did your interest in Warhol as a subject for scholarship begin?
Oh, well, I'm sure there's a respectable intellectual reason for it. There are just some personal exigencies that entered in a stage in my life when it was very difficult for me to live abroad or go do any new research in the areas I'd covered in the first two books. So some very helpful people who knew I was interested in recent and contemporary art started asking me to do things. And one of those topics, because I had always been interested in the relationship between popular culture and high art, that went back to the very first book on 18th century Paris. What was going on in the fairs and sideshows of Paris in relation to the subject matter and approaches of a painter like Watteau, you know. So people sort of drew a kind of parallel from that. And one of the things I was asked to do was address Warhol in relationship to the appropriation artists of the 1980s, you know, early Jeff Koons and Richard Prince and so on. And then when Warhol died, so sadly, prematurely, Art in America asked me to contribute something to as a kind of memorial. And then that was the basis for everything that followed. And it proved to be such an interesting intellectual problem talking about Warhol right at that stage, as we've been talking about before that, before the mid-'80s. Andy Warhol wasn't really a respectable topic for art historical investigation. He was seen, you know, as it struck me either as a symptom of a period or an opportunist who had gained fame in a sort of meretricious way. And that was the dominant view right across the board, not just among conservatives, but really among some of the postmodern, sort of cutting edge kind of people, held the same opinion. And that struck me as wrong, and so these opportunities gave me a chance to try to figure out at least a beginning way to discuss Warhol more seriously. And that turned out to be as a kind of, a pictorial equivalent of a kind of film noir realist. And then that has evolved. It's been a long time since that was written, 30 years ago. And in the meantime, for the new book, without abandoning it, I've tried to see a little more deeply into what's going on. One of the things that has struck people about the treatment of Warhol in the book is the presentation of his becoming a pop artist as something strange and something in need of explanation. And that's one of the things I think this exhibition demonstrates so well, that he was such a consummately skilled and adaptable illustrator in a free, emotive, linear manner, all his own, and had made himself famous and wealthy doing that. Yet somewhere around 1960-61, he more or less decides to gamble it all on becoming a gallery artist, which no one expected him to do, and no one took him seriously at the beginning in that ambition. And in the course of it, in a way, he had to self-negate all that skill that you see in the graphic work of the 50s, in order to come up with something that would, give him a niche, something really special and idiosyncratic within fine art.
And in your book, you reframe that really well, because you kind of start with the generalization that both general art historians and the greater public would assume that it's a kind of a natural progression, that he would just want to enter into the realm of fine art, when in fact it was a calculated risk on his part.
Yeah, it was a huge, as it was really for that whole generation. When Roy Lichtenstein decided to take some comic strip paintings to Leo Castelli, that was a gigantic gamble. And he really had to steel his courage with the help of certain people like Alan Capra in order to do it. And Warhol, we have to see in very much the same way. He had a secure profession. He was still identified as an illustrator and a graphic designer right through the mid-60s. And the people who knew him in that context, were sort of dimly aware that he had this art thing going on, and they probably, didn't take it very seriously until he had turned the tables on the whole relationship between fine art and graphic design.
It's curious. We were talking about this at lunch as well, because the timeline for our developing interests in Warhol are similar. We were at different points in our respective careers. I was in high school, and I remember I hadn't remembered. It struck me. It's much more prosaic, this narrative, but. It was AP American Literature. Some of you may have memories of this. And we had to write a year-long research report on an American author. And most of my fellow students, fellow colleagues in high school chose authors like Melville, Hawthorne, Fitzgerald, Salinger. And I insisted on doing Andy Warhol as an author. And my AP English teacher, Ms. Boron, was just as insistent that he was not an author, he was an artist, and I had to abandon that as a project. And I had to disagree with her, maybe not quite so respectfully, but I nevertheless did, because at the time I was a bookseller at Brentano's bookstore. That was my high school job, and I of course knew all the books that Warhol had published and was selling them, and everyone that I would come into the bookstore wanting to buy one of his books, I had the most amazing conversations with. So much more interesting than the people that sadly were buying Salinger. No disrespect to Salinger, but so I ultimately got approval, but actually also I was rethinking this the other day. Only after I had to get a special pass from the public school librarian in Santa Ana, California, that would allow me to access a university library, where I was going to be able to get the rest of the materials that the high school library or the public library didn't have. So this was my first trip to the University of California Irvine Library, and I was just overwhelmed by the availability of the materials, and brought them all home and studied them astutely. This was the first time that I ever read a novel cover to cover, the kind of epic piece that we may talk about later. But also I remember distinctly in the course that writing about Warhol may not have actually helped me on my AP exam. I don't think it did, but it certainly set a course for the rest of my interests after high school. But I also remember distinctly that I started the project in September, October of 1986, and Warhol died in February of 1987. So within that year, while I was working on this project, at the time that he died, I remember from the standing at the cash register at Brentano's, and we could look out at the magazine stands, and almost every cover of the magazines at that time, both from the US and Europe, had Warhol on the cover. So there was this explosion of information reappraisals that was happening, and I was trying my best as a very young person to assess that as well as the materials that he had written.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad that Ondine related that story. I was going to cue him to do so if it hadn't emerged as it did naturally in the course of the conversation. And yeah, that moment was a watershed in so many ways. It turned out to be one for both of us personally. Whether you can draw a causal connection between his death and suddenly people beginning to recognize how good an artist he was, almost the definitive artist of his era, respect and take it seriously, see him as a worthy object of interpretation and historical investigation.
That's right.
Now, as it happens, the Museum of Modern Art, Kynaston McShine, was preparing the retrospective that took place in 1989. Benjamin Buclow's essay for that catalog, on top of what we've just been discussing, suddenly just changed everything so dramatically that it was as if no one could remember what it had been like before, when cheap put-downs by Robert Hughes were sort of the norm, for understanding Warhol.
In this book that which I do encourage you all to buy downstairs, The Long March of Pop, you trace this fascinating and largely unexplored series of connections between folk art, folk music, and pop art. And you do this over the course of the entire book, and it's an absorbing and an incredibly rich history. But I wonder if you could just give us a little summary teaser, if you will, of some of those interrelations between folk art, folk music, and pop art.
Yeah, it's one of the things that struck me as I decided how far back this was going to go was that, as the first chapter is called, before there was pop, there was folk. And people of immense sophistication in New York in the 1930s and 1940s, like Alfred Barr, the founder of the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, Lincoln Kirstein, the founder of the American Ballet Theater, New York City Ballet, their friends were all fascinated by naive art. And they felt that it was emerging as an alternative to what they saw as a sort of derivative School of Paris kind of practice that they were, most familiar with in their immediate surroundings. And, much as the Cubists had admired Henri Rousseau, they found the Pittsburgh painter John Kane, for example, an ex-steel worker and saloon boxer, who had started painting late in his life, as a fresher alternative. And in the context of the 1930s, of the Depression era, the Popular Front, people with money and high social background in those days actually felt a little guilty about it and felt that they needed to find some means of solidarity with the mass of people, rural and urban, who were suffering from the conditions of the Depression. And folk art was at least a kind of symbolic bridge to the whole, to the idea of America as something that comprised everybody and of all classes. These kind of natural aristocrats like Barr and Kirstein were more involved with, folk painting and artifacts. But the equally cultivated intellectual leftists of the period got more involved with folk music and searching out, singers from the rural South mainly, who seemed to be speaking some deeper common humanity that those who, in a way, had been divorced from it by their education or their social background could rediscover. And so, some of our greatest American musicians, like Hughie Leadbelly, and Woody Guthrie, and Aunt Molly Jackson, so on, came to the fore as the objects not just of a sort of condescending, indulgence on the part of these people, but a new attention to the actual complexities of this kind of practice and modal harmonies, difficult, complicated vocal inflections, all these kinds of things suddenly became something you could be interested in. Then that got wiped out by the Red Scare after the war in the early 1950s, only to be rediscovered again in the 50s and by the generation that Bob Dylan came up through in the late 50s and early 60s, which then brings about a whole other story that reconnects with Andy Warhol, in fact.
Can you share some of that with us? In particular, the relationship maybe between Dylan and the factory and Warhol.
Well, Dylan had become, an acoustic folk protest icon, the representative of his generation, everybody said, the voice of his generation, speaking truth to power with his, solo acoustic guitar and harmonica rack. And that left him profoundly dissatisfied. He had more musical ideas and stranger musical ideas than that he wanted to find some vehicle for. He was friendly with and at the same time immensely envious of the Beatles because they were able to grow and weren't held back by some moralism about, this was the decayed version of the 30s and 40s folk aesthetic, becoming rigidified and codified. And he wanted to describe something different that was part of his environment, that was immediate and vivid, but also had some of the, deep allegorical traits of the old, Appalachian and Scots-Irish folk tradition going back to the late Middle Ages. So where do you find that? Well, he decided where you would find that is in the Warhol factory. And he did a large part of his absolute breakthrough album in this regard, 1965, Highway 61 Revisited, by elliptically, but at the same time very legibly describing the Warhol factory. Like a Rolling Stone is about Edie Sedgwick and Warhol almost without remainder. Every line can be, in fact, easily construed as not telling their story like a kind of chronicler, but transforming it, into a story of his own, but was, say, relatable at almost every point to the strange, outlandish, highly expressive character of the factory as Warhol had fashioned it as almost a social work of art. And so that work of art would be transposed or flipped into Dylan's own work of art, and he would use now a pop vehicle, pop instrumentation, and tap into the genius of the pop music world. Find a Mike Bloomfield, who, need, give ground to no one as a musical practitioner and sensibility. And then, meld that with his own verbal dexterity.
And is it 66 when Warhol then also releases the Chelsea Girls and records the Velvet Underground?
Yeah, which was, I think, that's not in the book, I have to say, so I don't want to leave any false impressions. Partly just a matter of space and the momentum of the narrative at that point, which was going in a different direction.
Although what's interesting, it's almost cliche to say now that, that with the Velvet Underground that so few people bought the record, right? It sold a handful, hundreds, maybe a couple hundred
Yeah.
copies when it was first released. But the kind of cliche is that all the people that bought it ended up forming their own band. So that kind of DIY, do-it-yourself kind of aesthetic, that is what propels the punk movement, and you address that in the book. That there's also kind of direct connections from the Warhol factory into the glam rock movement with people like Bowie and the New York Dolls and Wayne County.
David Bowie writes a song called Andy Warhol. He was infatuated, even before he ever witnessed the factory, with the idea of it. But, the Velvet Underground, too, was this same mixture of immense sophistication and a deliberate, not primitive exactly, but sort of rudimentary, faux naive kind of simplicity. John Cale, who was the kind of driving musical force, already had great credentials as an avant-garde player and composer in New York. He had worked with Lamont Young before. He was a master of his instrument, which was the viola. And then he harnessed that and sort of twisted and distorted it into a kind of sound world that would support Lou Reed's sophistication in a kind of hard-boiled American literary dialect, which he had spent a lot of time honing. But then they recruited a drummer, one of the first women to get any prominence in the rock world at that time, Mo Tucker, who was perfect. Because if they'd had a flashy drummer, it would have just killed the whole synthesis that they were after. And actually, I think, Ondine, you've got a good story about Mo Tucker, don't you? About her involvement with Warhol.
Yes. Well, it has to do with the recording technologies that Warhol used as a method of production, both, in this play with kind of recording and transcription and duplication and seriality, and the different people that he kind of employed to help him pursue these pursuits. And it connects directly to one of the objects that's in this show, which, if you haven't already seen it, when you walk out, I ask you to, which is one of the first early portable tape recorders produced by the Philips Norelco Corporation. It was invented in about 1964. The model that we have there is from 1965, and the Philips Corporation sent it to Warhol, before it had really been released in a commercial market, hoping that he would find some way to experiment with it, utilize it in some form. And as it turns out, Warhol, it became his constant companion, to the point where Warhol would describe the tape recorder somewhat coyly as his wife. And this became the basis for his first novel, a novel which was ostensibly, the idea was it was supposed to be 24 hours with the kind of amphetamine-fueled loquaciousness and outrageousness of the most outrageous homosexual known at the factory, who is my namesake, Ondine. And so the idea was that he spend 24 hours with him and record it, and that would then become the basis for a novel, and it would simply be transcribed. It took more, it was more like 15 hours. It took longer to produce than strictly 24 hours. And then it took 2 years to produce and to transcribe. Mo Tucker was one of the people who did the transcription. But she refused to transcribe any of the swear words, of which there were plenty. And then he also had these two high school students from Brooklyn that would spend their kind of days after school and on vacations and during the summer typing for him, transcribing these recordings. And they took the name, he gave them the name super secretaries. And the super secretaries took about 2 years to transcribe this, and had convinced Warhol that it was like the hardest, most labor-intensive, onerous work that they could ever be expected to do. And it was completely volunteer. I think their high school journalism teacher said, "Oh, go interview some artists." They went to Leo Castelli. Leo Castelli called Warhol and sent them over. And there's some interesting stories there too about how Warhol's form of duplication and reproduction is never exact, right? Even with these mechanized forms. And one of the super secretaries decides to take one of the tapes home, the tape for chapter 15, and comes home and finds that her mother has confiscated it. Because her mother didn't appreciate what was being said on the tape. So that disappeared completely. The story continues, though. This super secretary, Kathy Nasso, then later goes off to Pratt and becomes an artist herself. And in exchange for all the volunteer work, Warhol gives Kathy 2 works of art. One is a small flowers, a square canvas of the flowers, and the other is a 1965 self-portrait, which she treasures, but holds on to, framed simply under glass, holds on to and stores in her closet. In 2009, the super secretary decides that maybe this piece belongs to the art world, and maybe it might be time to sell it. So she auctions it with Sotheby's. Sotheby's writes a press release in which the title to the press release is, "After 42 years, Warhol comes out of the closet." And supposedly it was in pristine condition because it had been protected from light over all the years by being stored in the closet. It was estimated to sell in 2009 for $1.4 million and ended up selling for 6.1. So, as a great payment for the transcription.
You know, that just sparks me thinking too that I guess that you're all here, that this show is here and is part of a wonderful, almost continual cycle of exhibitions that the Warhol Museum has been responsible for setting in motion and, you know, so beautifully crafted here. Is that Warhol and the Warhol Factory never get old. They never seem dated and somehow, you know, just part of that bygone era where virtually everything else in that kind of madmen universe looks, you know, like it's completely remote and only can be retrieved through a lens of nostalgia and a kind of historical connoisseurship. But when we talk about the factory, talk about the personalities, many of them gone now or, you know, aged, you know, far beyond any conception of glamour, it's as if none of that happened, as if it had just happened yesterday. And people can find a way to map their own lives onto the factory in a way that keeps it continually fresh. And this, to me, must lie at the heart of Warhol's aesthetic achievement. The thing that it took people, as we were saying at the beginning, so long to recognize that it was just opaque. And guess until, you know, enough time had passed that this perpetual freshness started to seem startling and undeniable and something that you had to make sense out of.
And I guess with that perpetual, I'm curious, I'm thinking about, if I can turn it to a moment, to teaching, right? And thinking about, given the sheer range and magnitude of Warhol's production, and also the kind of what seems like a kind of non-stop interest in kind of publications, right, and additional materials that have come out about Warhol. How do you teach Warhol? Have the approaches changed over the year? I mean, how and how is that perpetual freshness, right, maintained in the classroom environment? In a classroom environment.
Yeah. Part of the work's done for you. I mean, I may teach a unrepresentative sample of New York students for whom I think part of the attraction of New York, if they're from elsewhere, is that it has this aura already, and that they want to be part of it. The 1950s work is not an automatic connect, I don't think, because it is period specific, I think. His points of reference in his draftsmanship, which he doesn't really bother to disguise. He never bothered to disguise his sources. But in the 50s, it's earlier artists, draftsmen like Jean Cocteau, often an underestimated source for him. Ben Shahn, very famously, the now not so well-known popular front artist David Stone Martin, whose work he in fact collected. Some of these go back to his Pittsburgh working class, trade union environment kind of roots. And whimsy. I think whimsy is just about gone now. But as a part of a sophisticated sensibility in the 1950s, early 60s, it was a big thing. The sort of style that Warhol and his friends in the design world cultivated, kind of insouciance, apparent casualness, taking an interest in, seemingly sentimental or trivial things, and raising that to a level of high refinement and distinction. I think that takes a little more work to bring people back into that mindset. Of course, now that sexual politics and gender considerations have become normal, part of our discussion, and something that can be spoken about with frankness, does allow you to maybe reconstruct that, camp world, for lack of a better word, in a way that would have been harder to do in the past. So I think maybe it's a trade-off.
That's right. But at the same time, and I agree that it can be discussed or introduced. I do find that camp as both an aesthetic mode of reception and production is one of those. I'm not going to follow the Susan Sontag route and say that it's apolitical, but I do think that generationally, the element of camp is. Let me just say that my students aren't coming to the classroom with a sense of camp.
They aren't.
No.
No, and
camp has been lost somehow generationally.
I was trying to use every other word I could think of.
Except that one, because it's so loaded, right?
I used that word because, and I used it just in a way because I got tired and just as a form of shorthand. Because I also don't think I think the Sontag essay really is a period artifact and not a guide to what we're looking at all. It needs to be described. The personalities have to be understood. The spectrum of relationships and mode of affect and so on, it almost becomes a subject in itself. But maybe to circle back on an earlier topic, Warhol doesn't abandon his friends and his old connections by any means. I think was a very loyal person. But I think he also saw that, much as Dylan saw the acoustic folk world, as something that was starting to enclose him, and that he wasn't able to reach out to the kinds of references that the silkscreen paintings and the films allowed him to do. Mm-hmm. The films, of course, partaking of that sensibility, but on another level and in a much more forceful, and direct kind of medium. There are continuities like his love of reproductive techniques. The silkscreen follows from the imprinting and the blotting, and his doing his blots and drawings as often as not from photographic material, and deciding at a certain point, I guess, to cut out the middleman and go directly to the simulation of photographs through the photo silkscreen process. But another thing I think that came out of that, because it had a mechanical nature, it lent itself to the use of assistants, and an inspired assistant like Gerard Malanga, without which the bulk of the work really wouldn't have been possible for him to do. And that made the factory, the need for collaboration, or the conduciveness of his technique to collaboration, meant that he could have a lot of people around him, which is something he liked for its own sake. And the importance of collaboration and so much art practice that's followed and has become just mushrooming, in recent years, I think arose from Warhol's sense that authorship could be dispersed. And we all know he was fascinated with Hollywood and wanted to make films, and Paul Morrissey, he was recruited and wanted to be a Hollywood director, and so the film side of the factory burgeoned. But I tend to think that the collaboration with the paintings was so attractive. Why not take up a medium that had even more collaboration in it, that required actors and lots of people to help? And we should just mention Billy Name, just as a catalyst right the way through, as a crucially important person, a great person, still famously with us today, as facilitating this. Naturally, it benefited Warhol's kind of fantasy life in the realm of film and film stars. In Bob Dylan's Desolation Row from 1965, he talks about the superhuman crew who go out from the factory, et cetera, as if you needed to make it more explicit what he's actually talking about. The idea of the superstar, that is, if you're below the real stars in Hollywood, well, why not put yourself above? And that's the way an artist would think. That's the way an artist would imaginally recreate the situation. And then, they all have such vivid characteristics. That's why he wanted to put them in front of the camera so he wouldn't have to do very much work, that they would do it all with a little scripting from Ronald Tavel. And everybody had a different name. Everybody had a stylized personality. So here you are in this world of allegory, of types who are, say, defined by a pre-given sort of role or set of traits, which is the thing that Dylan saw. The thing that, he called the superstars the superhuman crew. He saw that right away and very early in the evolution of this whole side of Warhol's work.
Excellent.
Did Calder know Warhol?
I'm
talking about Lindsay and Corbin.
I wouldn't be surprised if they knew one another, but the fact that Calder's sensibility is formed, much earlier in the 20s and 30s, and brings out, maybe the forbidden secret of surrealism, that it had lots of whimsy as opposed to psychological profundity in it. But I wouldn't be surprised. Warhol, before he was even known as an artist, he was understood by people in the art world to be somebody in the design world, somebody in fashion. But somebody in the fashion world. I don't mean somebody in fashion as trendy. I mean, he was in, that was his milieu, was fashion. But the way they knew him was that he was the guy who came to all the openings. he was just a, he was a habitué of any kind of social occasion that the art world could present that he could get into. And that's why it came as a big surprise to people when suddenly he had paintings in galleries. And it took him a lot of, I have to say, readjustment to
after first having to show them in department stores like Bonwit Teller, which is where he had his first.
And so he was making up, a lot. The early comic strip paintings were a fictional artifact. They were like, say, what if there were paintings based on comic strips? And that the mannequins wearing these clothes lived in the world where there were such paintings, which already, introduces kind of layer on layer into his first exercises in the genre.
Excellent.
Ivan Karp was the intermediate. I mean, he was Leo Castelli's right-hand man, as most people know who are familiar with the era. He rejected Warhol, and Warhol never showed with Castelli until much later. They'd already taken on board Lichtenstein, and that was because Karp was a friend of Caprau's. If you're interested, it's because Karp had managed the Hansa Gallery, which was this cooperative gallery downtown that Caprau had been part of, and so they knew each other from that. That's how Caprau got Lichtenstein into the Castelli Gallery, was through those connections. But it was the kind of connections between, sort of made artists that Warhol didn't enjoy at that point. So he had to go around, and it was really via Los Angeles and Irving Blum and Walter Hopps that Warhol, was able to get up to the next level of recognition. Do you have any thoughts about L.A. in this scenario?
I mean, Warhol's first gallery exhibition that isn't in one of these other kind of hybrid, fashion or design spaces, is in Los Angeles at the Ferris Gallery, first with soup cans and then later with the Elvises and the Liz's. And it seems that after that provided him some entree into the New York gallery scene and world. But there's a lot more to be said about Warhol and Los Angeles in particular. But maybe we should save that for another time to see if there are other questions.
In the front row.
I just wonder where you place him in the canon, the art historical canon of pop art. Was he the man?
That's a good question. I'm always maybe a little bit more hesitant to kind of make those type of categorical judgments, but based in the beginning, no, certainly not. No, not at all. And you do a really remarkable job kind of tracing that history in your book. And what I try to do also, at least in my teaching, is to try and also provide students with this sense of the historiography, to review how and when the critical shifts happen with regard to Warhol, because you can see it. You may not see it, you can clearly see it change over time quite dramatically. But it seems to have consolidated in a way today where it would suggest just that he is the preeminent or premier pop artist. Although that certainly wasn't the case at the time. I can say when it comes to my teaching, somehow or another I managed to insert Warhol into almost every single class I teach. So
it's partly because Warhol's expanded our sense of what pop art is.
Yeah.
Just to be strictly a painter now looks a little limited by comparison to film, music, this broader expression in terms of style and the interpenetration of fiction and everyday life. All of that is now what we think of as belonging to pop, rather than an artist taking these materials and boiling them down, into a framed work on canvas. When that was the norm, say 1962, 63, Warhol was not in the top group. His friend Robert Indiana was far more prominent at that point. And now he, for reasons that, are now I think being corrected, sort of fell out of that for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are, sort of arbitrary, and you're constantly, as an historian, constantly looking at the way that reputations stand at any given time, and I at least find myself saying, well, is this right? And if it's not right, what does one need to go back and say or look into in order to give these artists, their proper due?
Yeah. There's also ways in which I think it is cyclical, but it's also more than that in some ways, because there are current forms of popular entertainment and art that Warhol's work that in experimentations during, in particular in the 60s, now we can see that they kind of suggest or prophesize, but they weren't known at the time. I mean, I think of Warhol very clearly as being one of the kind of originators of what we now come to know as reality television, right? Those early films, were pushing a form of realism, and the individuals were not playing characters, they were playing themselves as types, kind of, accommodating the demands of the camera, and he was bringing them into the factory and in front of the camera, knowing details from their personal lives and kind of casting them in a way that reality television is cast to kind of promote conflict and generate drama, knowing that real drama, when it erupts on camera, will be more profound and perhaps more entertaining for the distant voyeur than scripted realism. And so that's something certainly that, at the time, we now think of the kind of origins of reality television being 1973 with PBS's An American Family featuring the Louds from Santa Barbara, which also has a Warhol connection because Lance was obsessed with Warhol and entered into a correspondence with him by writing Warhol when he was in high school. And then, of course, when Lance lives at the Chelsea Hotel, and when Pat Loud visits the Chelsea Hotel, Hollywood Lawn, one of the superstars who's still with us, but I think is at Cedars-Sinai right now, is ill, is in the hallway. So, yeah.
So interesting what you said about Dylan and Warhol, because I just don't think of them. I know they inhabited the same era, but I don't think of them, in fact, as being the kind of person that you could like both of them at the same time. That if you liked Warhol, you wouldn't like Bob Dylan. If you liked Bob Dylan, you wouldn't like Warhol. And I was trying to think of why that would be. And in the kind of the concept of the word that comes back is like something like authenticity. That is, folk music, to go to Dylan would be to have a kind of a more authentic, whatever that might be, relationship to some earlier moment in American music or something like that. And that Warhol is not about personal expressiveness, but about the kind of remediation of images, right, through different media. So where does that kind of notion or that kind of moment in art or in music, how does that operate across those two? Or is that just where the paths converge and that's one of the places?
Well, you summed that up very eloquently in terms of the sort of received ideas about both artists. But I think those perceptions, while not entirely erroneous, were based on misunderstandings of both artists. And that early essay I wrote, 87, about Warhol as a kind of dark American realist, was meant to go against the grain of that stereotype. And I think when you look at even the celebrity portraits, there is emotional depth there based on, borrowed materials, found materials, reconfigured with a kind of eloquence that's impossible to imitate. I mean, Warhol built his career on seeming, facsimile reproductions of pre-existing things, but he's the hardest artist to fake. You can spot a Warhol fake a mile away. Anybody can do it. And artists who are much more crafted and you think much more individual and idiosyncratic in their technique are more easily imitated by fakers. And so that paradox points towards something deeper about Warhol that it's taken a long time to emerge. Then, on the other hand, the authentic troubadour character of Dylan, he was the first person to get sick of that and not want to do it anymore, and to confound his audience intentionally. When he debuted like a Rolling Stone at the Newport Folk Festival, surrounded by Appalachian, dulcimer players and, everything that, and I love them, and don't mean to disparage them in the slightest. But as a context, if you wanted to stand out in a puff-sleeved polka dot silk shirt, tight trousers and pointed boots and styled hair with a Fender Stratocaster, you're saying that idea of authenticity. Well, I know Dylan thought this through, and while he respected that immensely, he thought that at that time, people had run out of room as far as capturing it or imitating it. To continue it is exactly what he wanted to do, but continue it not through imitation, but through reconfiguring it so you had a new, fantastic folk world that you could write music about. And that's what Like a Rolling Stone and Highway 61 Revisited represented. And he, didn't miss a trick in terms of drawing the contrast between what he wanted to do then, which was closer to Warhol. He said, he was going to take Elvis, he was going to take Little Richard, he was going to take all the musicians he'd admired when he was in high school, and bring them back into this higher artistic synthesis. While Warhol was, taking stuff, newspaper photographs and things, but finding the pathos there, and the pathos that could not be expressed, I think, in any other way. Any other way would have just lapsed into sentimentality and derivativeness. And he understood that. So it had to look like something else. It had to look like indifference in order not to be indifferent, I guess is the way I'd have to put it. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ondine and Tom for this really elucidating look at Warhol. I think an artist we obviously know well, but are still learning much about. So thank you both. And I'd like to invite everyone to join us outside, I think, hopefully it's not raining, on the patio for some drinks and some more conversation with Tom and Ondine. So thanks for coming.
You.